Welcome to Regent College. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person. And welcome to all of you who join us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent. Welcome from Vancouver, this beautiful land that we have the blessing to call home, from which we acknowledge that Regent College sits on the traditional and ceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nation people. We have another very interesting registered, subscribed to get email updates. You know how relevant it is to be up to date about what is happening here at Regent. If you have not subscribed to email updates, I would like to invite you to. All you have to do is to grab one of these little blue cards that are all the way back to the By the Donations box. When you grab that, you have two options. The blue is for you to follow the link, and in that way you can subscribe digitally. The other option is to fill the information here. It's just your name and your email address, and we will subscribe for you here at Regent. Either way, this is the best way to be up to date about what is happening here at Regent. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, if it rings, buzzes, or dings, right now is the time to put it on silent mode by any sound during our lecture. Lastly, those of you who join us in person, please be reminded that we are recording and live streaming this event under the conditions spelled out by the notice posted in the door here at Chapel, and also the Regent doors. At this point, I would like to introduce Richard Thompson. He is the Director of Advancement, our host tonight. Richard.
Thank you, Pablo, and what a delight to welcome you to Regent College on this gorgeous spring evening, and to our online audience, wherever in the world you are. So glad that you could be here. And what a delight to welcome back Dr. Darrell Bock. Darrell has joined us. This is his fourth occasion. He's been coming here since 2015, so happy 10th anniversary with Regent, and we're so glad that you're back with us again. In a moment, I will more formally introduce Dr. Bock to you. Let me just tell you how the evening will proceed. After I've introduced our speaker, he will speak to you for 50 minutes or so. Following that time, I will come up and give instructions about our Q&A period. I would say right now, for those who are online, you can submit a question anytime, and you can just send that to questions@regent-college.edu. That also applies to everyone gathered here live in person. At any point, if you have a question and you don't want to hold on to it until the end of the lecture, or you're not fond of getting up in front of a microphone, you too can just submit that question to the email address questions@regent-college.edu. We'll have a Q&A period that will take us to approximately, and no later than 9 o'clock, at which point you will be dismissed, and those who are here in person can meet Dr. Bock in the bookstore, where he will make himself available for a book signing. So that's how our evening will proceed. Let me tell you a little bit about our lecturer for this evening. Darrell Bock is the Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, where he serves as Executive Director of Cultural Engagement at the Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership. He is also an elder and staff advisor at Bent Tree Fellowship in Carrolton, Texas, and has served on the board of Chosen People Ministries for over 2 decades. In addition, he serves on the board of Wheaton College, currently chairing the Academic Affairs Committee, as well as on the boards of the Institute for Global Engagement, the Hope Center of Dallas, and Christians in Public Service. Dr. Bock has authored or edited over 45 books, including a New York Times bestseller in nonfiction, Jesus and the Gospels, and the recently released Cultural Intelligence: Living for God in a Diverse, Pluralistic World. And as I said at the beginning, he's with us for the 4th time in his 10 years of coming to Regent. He is here this week teaching the historical Jesus as part of our 2025 summer program. And so would you join me in offering a very warm welcome to Dr. Darrell Bock.
I'm finding out who are the NHL hockey fans and who aren't, and you are in the aren't category. But in case you're worried about that, I hate to tell you, it's 5-1 Florida in the middle of the third period. So we are talking about this in the U.S. since we know it's been since 1993 that a Canadian won the Stanley Cup. And so I know most Canadians are rooting for the Oilers. Of course, I'm from Dallas, and you all dismissed my team, so, you know, that's the way it goes. So I wanted to timestamp this lecture, and I don't know of a better way to do it than referring to the Stanley Cup while we're doing what we're doing. I want to ask a question of you to start off with. How many of you either been to London or to Sydney? Okay, since we're in the Commonwealth, look at that. That is impressive. Well, so I have a little more fun here. How many of it is it London? Almost everybody. Okay, how many are Sydney? Oh, look at that. Well, that's not too bad. Some of you are world travelers. Some of you kept your hand up both times. If you go to either of those places, you will see a sign that greets you. I think it's more for the Americans than it is for anybody else. And it is there are two kinds of signs. One is to tell you to look in the right direction because of traffic. But if you're in the subway, there is a sign that says "Mind the Gap." In fact, it's everywhere on the platforms before you get on the subway itself. And of course, the intent is to make sure that you step off the platform and mind the gap between that and the train so that when you step on the train, because if you miss that step, you will have a quick trip to Hades, which is not recommended. And so you need to pay attention to gaps where they exist. So I want to talk about gaps tonight, and I want to lay this out for you kind of physically, because we're going to refer to this physical break and gap in what I'm going to say. So I'm going to start off with this, and because I've got to do it this way in order to do it. But think of the events of the life of Jesus, because the subtitle of this talk is From Event to Gospel. And think about 33 AD. That's the year that Jesus was crucified. That's debated among New Testament scholars. It's a legitimate debate. It's not a sign of liberal or conservative. It's just dealing with the uncertainty we have about the exact chronology of Jesus' life, because we're not sure how certain years are counted, whether they're counted inclusively or not. And when we do all that, that's the gap that ends up being presented. So Jesus was either crucified in 30 or 33 AD. So come on down here, and this is the gap that we're creating. And you come to the earliest Gospels, which most scholars say the first Gospel, and then Matthew and Luke shortly thereafter on conservative dating. That dating places the Gospels in the 60s. So we have basically a 30-year gap between the time of the event and the time of the writing of a Gospel. More liberal dating of the Synoptic Gospels might put them in the 80s. That's in a 50-year gap. And then when we think of the Gospel of John, most people date the Gospel of John in the 90s. That's a 60-year gap. Is important because we have to ask the question, how in the world did we get from the event in the 30s to the recording of that event in the Gospels either 30 or 50 or 60 years later? That's the question. Now, most Christians who have a belief in the inspiration of the Bible, etc., this question. They don't even think about it. They go, well, the Bible's inspired. It's inspired by God. He took care of the problem of how can we be sure that what happened here is what was recorded down there. But I will remind you that in our world, there are many people who don't have a religious bone in their body. And so they are members of what is statistically called the nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, because there's a big difference. And so these are people who have no religious affiliation, no religious orientation, etc. In the United States, this figure is around 30%. I know it's higher here. I forgot what the figure was. There was a time when I looked it up and knew. I think it may be closer to 40 or 50% here. Anyway, that means that there are people who, when they think about the Gospels, are thinking about, look at this, I'm being rescued. Give me this this one so it works. Look at that, so I can move around. So that means that there are people who, when they ask these questions, are asking what is actually a natural historical question, which is, how do we get from the event to the writing of the gospel? And then there are people, that's a big gap, and there are a lot of things that can go on in the interim. In fact, I would suggest there were a lot of things that did go on in the interim. And so the question becomes, how do you deal with that kind of a question? Well, in order to deal with it, you've got to deal with a variety of things that are going on. First of all, you're in an oral culture. I'll be talking about that more in just a second. Secondly, you've got to deal with the relation of witnesses and memory, because at the key here is the way in which memory works for eyewitnesses. So I'm going to walk you through a conversation that exists in New Testament studies about elements of this and how to think about it in relationship to the gospel. So with that in mind, we will get formally started. That was the introduction. And I introduce it by simply saying an oral world is not a print or digital world. In the beginning, there were no books. In the beginning, there was memory and the passing on of anything of importance by word of mouth. That was the primary way from an event to being recorded. Only it gets recorded orally versus being recorded in written form, which, by the way, introduces another complication, because how do you trace oral recording? In the digital world, you record it, but in an oral world, you can't. So you just have the passing on of how things were done orally, and you have it by reporting and comparing stories and that kind of thing. So here's the claim that comes from the more skeptical side of this conversation. It goes, tradition called in the United States the memory game. The memory game is a game that you play, when you gather a group of people together and you just want to do something a little unusual, and you have a story at the start, and then they whisper it to the next person and to the next person, the next person, and it's long enough to be, a challenging exercise. The next person, until it gets to the end of the sequence, and the game is the story at the end at all like the story that you started off with? I actually like the name. This is given not here in Australia and New Zealand. They call it Chinese Whispers. It's just a great name for the game, because you're whispering the story from person to person so the person next to them can't hear it. Well, the argument is this: that tradition is loose in this period, in this 30 to 50 to 60 year period, like the memory game, and so you can't trust what you get. You see the name Bart Ehrman there. He teaches New Testament at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He has written the most popular book on the introduced on university campuses in the U.S., in Canada, and in England. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's been in 7 editions in a little more than a decade. Extremely popular textbook. And this is what he says. This is how he says the gospel tradition works in an oral world. Now, there's a second claim that comes with it that also is designed to challenge the way we think about the Gospels. And this comes from John Dominic Crossan, who was a well-known Jesus scholar, particularly in the 1990s, who was co-chair of a thing called the Jesus Seminar. I'm going to talk about an exchange he and I had in an academic context at Southern Methodist University in a little bit. He actually is a great conversation partner. He, even though he's coming from a different place, you can have a good conversation with him about the nature of what it is that you're discussing. And he said this, he said, even if there were eyewitnesses, and he actually believes the tradition is influenced by eyewitnesses who walked and talked with Jesus, memory itself is not really trustworthy. Memory leaks. And so, especially if you're thinking about memory over a long period of time, if you're thinking about, well, let's do the exercise. It's 2025. How well do you remember things in 1975? Or 1965, or even if we were doing conservative and just doing 30 years, You want that? Oh, okay, that worked. So thank you. Anyway, think about the events that might attach to any of those years and how well you might remember them. And you'll see the nature of the problem that's being raised. How well do you remember something that goes back all that way? So that's the nature of the problem. Let me size it a little more. Let me give you some quotes that summarize what we're talking about. Here's a quote from the book that I've already mentioned, an historical introduction to early Christian writings. It's a subtitle. The main title is The New Testament. This is from Bart Ehrman, and this is what he says. Even the Gospels pose problems for historians, however, since they are written long after the facts they narrate. That's the allusion to the gap of 30, 50, or 60 years. They narrate by people who had not witnessed the events. He doesn't think we know the name of any of the gospel authors connected, but two of them were not. And so he might raise the question that way. By people who had not witnessed the events they described and relied on inconsistent oral and written traditions about Jesus. So he thinks the oral tradition in the period between event and gospel is pretty freewheeling. In fact, in the text that he writes, he tells the story about in the Mediterranean basin somewhere who was a Christian, moving from one place to another and telling the stories about Jesus, and they can say anything they want about him because there's no oversight of what he's saying and telling the next person down the road in the next town or village or city that he is visiting. So that's Bart Ehrman. Here's a second quote. It comes from Michael White, professor of classics. I went to university in Austin, Texas, and I actually took Greek. My initial classes in classical Greek and then eventually into Koine were taken at the University of Texas. I'm older than Michael White, so he wasn't there when I was there, but he's professor of classics at UT Austin. He was the consultant for a major series called From Jesus to Christ, a PBS special on Jesus, that when it was first released back in the 1990s was seen by 13 to 15 million people. This is his quote on the nature of this tradition. The problem for any historian of Jesus' life is that we don't have sources that come from the time of Jesus himself. And so I look at that, and what I tell students is when you get into these discussions, what can be tricky is someone can say something that's technically accurate, but that also at the same time can be misleading. So let me parse this sentence for you so that you can see what I'm talking about. That none of the sources that we have, the Gospels themselves, are dated after the life and ministry of Jesus, and actually by quite some time. I've already specified how many decades are involved. But what this hides is the idea that the traditions that feed into those sources did come from people who walked and talked with Jesus, at least in part. So this is a sentence that's technically correct on the one hand, but also is misleading on the other because of what it leaves out. And so, but this is the kind of thing that sometimes we're dealing with in these conversations. So when we think about this space, we have to think about orality, we have to think about eyewitnesses, we have to think about memory. And so I'm going to take you through a discussion of each of those areas, what I'm going to say to you. So this brings us to the types of ancient orality. The name Bailey there stands for Kenneth Bailey. He was a New Testament professor who lived in the Middle East and ministered to Bedouin tribes, as well as teaching and being an instructor in New Testament. And so these were non-literate cultures and so he wrote a short article back in the 1990s in which he said, I think there are three types of orality that I think we deal with when we discuss this in New Testament. It's really important to know which one you're dealing with when you're dealing with the Gospels. And he labeled them in the three categories that you see on the slide: informal and uncontrolled, formal and controlled, and informal and controlled. The first one, informal and uncontrolled, means that whatever is circulates with no oversight and it can go anywhere. That's the Bart Ehrman model. That's the model that goes back to form criticism of the 1920s. Names like Rudolf Bultmann, who was the most dominant New Testament figure of the 20th century. This is where he was coming from. And the idea was anyone could tell the story. They could tell it in any way they wanted. There was no control. And the basis for making this argument that's to study it, how orality worked, was rooted in studies of Icelandic folklore stories, which come from the medieval period. And I like to joke, well, at least they got the first letter of the country right to Icelandic folklore stories. And this was the way it was initially presented, is that oral tradition, yes, there was a way of forming oral tradition, but it was loose and could go anywhere. You could add anything. You could make changes. No one was overseeing it, and eventually it landed in the forms that we see in the New Testament. Now, there was a pushback to this from New Testament scholars, some of whom also engaged in Judaism that came out of the 1920s and into the 30s and 40s, and they argued a different model. They said the model wasn't Icelandic folklore stories. The model was the rabbis of Judaism. So now we're in Egypt. We are in the area of the Middle East. We're also, of course, in Israel. And so the argument was this was a completely different form with a completely different result. It was formal and it was controlled. Structure for how to do it, and there were only certain people who could pass on the tradition in a way that was recognized by everybody. So it was formal and controlled. It's like the rabbis, and the argument was this is actually very precise. Some rabbis would memorize the whole of the Torah, or might memorize the whole of the Mishnah, or even later, the whole of the Talmud, which are massive amounts of material. And the argument was, this is the model. Now, this model comes, in one sense, from the right cultural context. It's a Jewish context, which matches the idea that this came out of Israel and people connected to Israel. And so this had initially a persuasive way of trying to the informal and uncontrolled approach. But there was a problem. The problem was that the very precision that it argued for was a little too much. It didn't deal with what we see in the Gospels, which is we see stories that on the one hand have variation within them. You can look at the same events, see how they're told, and you can see some variation in how those are told. So this isn't as precise as the formal and controlled approach to orality, and therefore it didn't quite fit the phenomena that we see in the text in the New Testament, and it said in many ways too much. This led to the proposal that Bailey made, and Bailey said, when I look at the Bedouin tribes that I interact with, and his argument was, the way in which they passed on oral tradition is rooted in the history of passing on oral tradition, and it's been going on for centuries this way. And his argument was, it was informal but controlled. Now that sounds inconsistent, so just hang with me. It is that anyone can tell the story on the one hand, and that story can be told with some variation, but the gist has to be what the gist of the story is. And there's oversight of the core story, so much so that if anyone tells the story in the community and they wander off too far, there are elders in the community responsible for the oversight of the oral testimony who will correct the telling of the story on the spot. So it's an intermediate step between informal and uncontrolled and formal and controlled, and it allows for the variation, and it matches Bailey says, this matches the variation that we see in the stories in the Gospels on the one hand, while the gist of these stories remains consistent. And so he argued, that's the model. He claims the New Testament is this third type of orality. So in dealing with orality and the way it works in the ancient world, thinking through what the kind of orality is an important part of the conversation. So let's move on now to memory. And when we're dealing with memory, we're dealing with eyewitnesses. So now I've got to introduce to you a discussion that was part of a presentation that I participated in at Southern Methodist University years ago, and it was a discussion on eyewitnesses and memory. And they had invited John Dominic Crossan, and I've already given you his credentials, to come and speak to us on this. And he got up and he said, you know what, I believe there's eyewitness testimony in the tradition. I'm willing to accept that. But I also think memory leaks. There's no guarantee because you have eyewitnesses that what the eyewitnesses tell you is actually what happened, straight why this was and how he can make this argument. And he cited an example of a memory study, a very famous one, from Emory University, although it had just happened when he presented this, so I actually wasn't aware of it when he was sharing it. So Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, ran a memory study that went like this. The Challenger space shuttle was probably one of the most shocking disasters in the history of our space program in the United States. It exploded on takeoff with, I think there were 7 people total who passed away. But what made it particularly tragic was this was the space shuttle event in which a junior high school teacher had won a nationwide competition to be able to broadcast about science from space. So you had a middle school teacher who died along with the professional astronauts who were used to the potential of risking their lives in going up in a space shuttle. It was particularly tragic because the public nature of that event meant that the liftoff was actually broadcast live, which means that the explosion was also seen live. It was one of the traumatic events in people's lives of American history that go back in my lifetime to include things like Kennedy's assassination or 9/11. It had that kind of national cultural impact. And so Emory decided, well, let's do a study to see, this is a great event to pick out and see what memory's like. So they took first-year students, freshmen, and they brought them into a room and they said, we want to know how you found out about the Challenger disaster. Did you watch it or did you find out some other way? And where were you when you found out about it? I think I like to tease people that the premise may be a faulty one, that now they're seniors and about ready to graduate and leave, because, you know, theoretically you're supposed to take 4 years to go through college, and that key word there is theoretically. Anyway, on the premise that they were seniors, they asked them the same set of questions, and then they compared the answers. And what Crossan said, and he was reporting the results of the survey is in about 50% of the cases, the answers that they got 3 years down the line were different from the answers some of the participants gave right after the event. With those, they invited them back and said, here are the 2 sets of answers that you gave us. They didn't tell the people who are being studied, they didn't tell them which answer came from which date. They just put, here are the 2 answers that you've given us this question. They don't match up. Which is it? The largest majority picked the answer they had most recently given as opposed to the answer that they said right after the event. And Crossan says, there it is, memory leaks. You don't remember things accurately down the road. And so I can believe that there are eyewitnesses who are telling these stories, but I remember what's said or done accurately. And with that, he sat down, and it was my time to respond. And when I got up, because I was hearing about this for the first time, I raised a question that went like this. I said, well, it's one thing to ask freshmen at a college who have no connection to the space program and no association with the space program about a tragedy like this. It would be, I would suggest, I had to say I don't know this, but this would be something to study. I would suggest that if the results involve people who worked at NASA, people who either were responsible for the launch or astronauts or administrators tied to NASA because there was something at stake involved, that would produce a different result. Then the reality is they have done studies that distinguish between 2 audiences, people who are attached to what's being talked about and people who are not attached to what's being talked about. And the results of the memory are much, much better when there's something at stake. They aren't perfect, but they are much, much better. And that was one point that I made at the time and suggested, well, maybe Emory freshmen aren't the best people to ask this question, and maybe that's not the analogy with the apostles who had something at stake in what it was they were saying about Jesus. Well, about several years later, in fact, more than a decade later, I happened to be on sabbatical at Tübingen University with a man named Robert McIver, he was taking his sabbatical. He was wrapping up his sabbatical as I was starting mine, and we happened to be next door neighbors at the university in the university housing that hosted professors on sabbatical. And he was studying the issues of memory and the Jesus tradition and orality, and he wrote a book on it. It eventually came out. It was Jesus. I think that this is a rough title. It's not exactly right, but Jesus and Memory in the Gospels. And he went through not just the Emory study, but a whole series of studies about memory that have been done really in the last several decades, and used that to think about this period of memory and eyewitnesses. And what he argued was, what these studies show is after about 5 years, if you're remembering something, it tends to fossilize. In other words, after about 5 years, the way you remember this event becomes settled. And what you say after 5 years, what is consistent, even in any variation that happens over that 5-year period, is, generally speaking, the gist of the story is retained. So that's his point, was it fossilizes over a short period of time, but the gist of the story is pretty much on target. Now I need to tell you how the reality of the early church is different from the Emory study. And it goes like this. In the Emory study, you had an event, and then you asked people 3 years down the line about that event, but there's no guarantee that they had to retell the story of what you were asking them to remember. It was just event and then recall. That's not the way the early church tradition worked when it came to the teaching and life of Jesus. Because these stories were circulating through the church. They were part of the worship of the church. They were retold again and again and again and again in the context of the worship of the church. So you aren't dealing with an event that happens at one point and then only gets retold down the road. You're dealing with an event that gets repeated and reflected on again and again and again as it's retold. So that's one difference. The second difference is you're not dealing with the memory of just one person. You're dealing with corporate memory. You're dealing with apostolic memory, if you will. Those who are apostles and those who are disciples around them, that operates as a kind of check on the way in which the story gets told. So these differences are memory is not the same as individual memory, and repeated tellings is different from just telling the story once and then having to recall it after a passage of time. So all those are framing elements of this conversation that have to be kept in mind. And then it dawned on me, as I was thinking about this, that maybe we ought to think about the time, the way in which, that did change. Maybe we ought to think about the times in our culture where we're operating primarily in an oral context. And so that made me think of my kids and my grandkids before they learn to read and write. Because kids and grandkids, before they learn to read and write, live in primarily an oral world and an oral culture that they encounter in life. And this reminded me next of what I like to call, and if you've ever had children, you will know what I'm about to talk about, the evening bedtime story. The evening bedtime story. Think about it. You read to your kids at night in the hopes of calming them down so they'll go to sleep. And my premise that I operated with is I needed to do a job in doing this, that they would go to sleep through the night because you should only have to do this once every 24 hours. And so I'm thinking about the way in which this worked, and we used to read bedtime stories, and there was a Lutheran publisher who did biblical stories and put them in rhyme. And so these would be the little bedtime stories I would read to my two daughters and son. They were all within about 3.5 years of another, and so we would put them all to bed at the same time, and I would let them choose which story they were going to choose, and you know how that works. They come to have their favorites, and so you end up reading the same story again and again and again and again and again and again. And it's not the most thrilling assignment that a parent has in life, but it's something that you do because you love your kids and you want to, you want them to go to bed relaxed. And so we did this. Well, in case you can't tell, I have a little mischievous streak. Now and again, just to see if they were with me and just to see how it went, I would change the rhyme. I would change the story. And I would inevitably get a reaction from my kids. You know what that reaction was? You tell me. That's not how it goes. And they didn't say, that's not how it goes, Dad. Okay? They said it with emotion, as if I had betrayed them. That's not how it goes, Daddy. And if they were really worked up, okay, they would gather the rhyme that ought to be there that I had changed. Shame on Daddy. Okay? So or I could think about my grandkids. My grandkids were experts in Star Wars. They loved Star Wars movies, my two oldest grandsons. And I literally could play Star Wars on a thing called VHS. Remember what that was? Young ones. And so on a VHS recorder, and I could stop it, and I could say to them, what's coming next? And they would know. Why? Because they had seen it again and again and again and again, and they cared about Star Wars, and so they remembered what it said. So these are examples of humans functioning in an oral, very young humans, who, because the only way they're going to remember is if they remember it. They aren't writing it down or recording it or doing anything else. That's the way in which they're going to remember what's going on. And then I thought of a second circumstance. I said, can I think of one that involves people, of any age? And I thought about what happens when someone dies and you go either to the visitation before the funeral, or you go and meet together and gather in the house after a funeral. And what happens when people gather together? Okay? They talk about the person who died. I guarantee you that most people don't pull out a book or a set of notes that tells you this is about this person. No, they recall from their memory what this person did or said that struck them. And someone else in the room who knows them may chime in, add to what's going on, or may say something else or look at it from a different angle. That's us living in an oral world. And so that's an example of the way oral memory works. And when something hits us, and these two examples are stories people care about that are repeated, okay, or people that people care about that you are honoring their memory of, so there's something at stake, you can get a sense of how memory works in an oral context when we're not thinking about writing it down, taking notes, putting it on computer or whatever. So how do these actually work? Let's talk about the New Testament itself. So I want to deal with parallels where you've got the same story, but you've got different details. And the way I want to think about this is to talk about the fact, I'm going back to the idea of variation, story that has variation in it, because when you tell a story, you can quote it, you can summarize it, you can paraphrase it. There are lots of ways to communicate it, and on the one hand be accurate, but you may not be telling it with the same intensity or the same precision, and that might be intentional because of the way you're telling the story or the way you're recalling it. And what normally happens with these kinds of differences is a skeptic will basically equals contradiction. Okay, so I point out the difference, I show the difference doesn't work, and I say, look, there's a problem, it's a contradiction, they're not saying the same thing. End of story. It's actually the easiest thing to do. What I'm going to suggest to you is you can have difference without having contradiction. I'm going to take you through several examples. So here's the first one. The first one doesn't involve Jesus. The first one involves Paul. and the appearance. I'm going to come back to this later. This is why one of the reasons I'm telling this. In Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26, the author of Luke Acts, who I think is Luke, basically tells the same story 3 times. But there are interesting differences, particularly between the first and the last telling. In the first telling, you get a lot of detail, and there's a character who's a major character in the telling. That's Ananias. Ananias is the one who gives the commission of God to Saul after he restores his sight. Remember, he saw the bright light and couldn't see for several days. So after his sight is restored, he gives the commission, and so he's a key player in the first telling of the story. By the time we get to Acts 26 and the story is retold, as reported by Luke from Paul, Ananias is missing in action. He's not even after and in the discussion. Now, I understand that one person could say, well, this is the same author. He knows he's repeated himself, so he's left out certain details. That certainly is possible. But there are other stories that Luke retells where he consciously retells the same story the exact same way. This is the Cornelius and Peter incident when the gospel went to Gentiles for the first time. And the retelling is virtually exact the last time. What I think this variation shows is what's possible in the retelling of the same story, and what you get is variation and gist. You get variation in the details, but the core story is the same. What turned Paul around was the appearance of Jesus and the realization that dawned on him that Jesus was actually resurrected from the dead. Or let's go to the next one, the parable of the soils. And for this one, we've got to look at Scripture. After all, this is a biblical lecture, so it might be good to open the Bible. So let's do that. Let me put this here for a second while I get set up. So if you brought a device or you have a Bible with you, this is a good time to pull it out to show that you're deeply committed. And well, you can follow along with me. So let's start off in Mark. Mark chapter 4. And we're going to look at the parable of the sower. And we're just going to look at what happens, what the interpretation is with the seed that fell on the road. And this is what it says in verse 15 of chapter 4 of Mark. And those are the ones along the path where the word is sown, and when they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. Okay? God gave you a brain. That brain operates with memory. We can call it a cache, like a computer. Put Satan in your cache when it comes to Mark chapter 4. Now let's go to Matthew. Matthew 13. And here we are in verse 19 of Matthew 13, and it says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. Okay, so now we don't have Satan. In Matthew, we have the evil one. I was asked in class today when I talked about this, is the Greek different here? Yes, these are good translations of the Greek. So the difference isn't a variation in translation choice. It's based on the language of the original text. And so that's Matthew 13. Let's go to Luke chapter 8, where the parallel is. And in Luke chapter 8, and in verse 12, we get this. The ones along the path are those who... Then the devil comes and takes away the word from their heart, so they may not believe and be saved. So, is it Satan? Is it evil one? Is it devil? Doesn't matter. The way I like to say this is, the wording is different, but the referent is the same. Whether we're talking Satan or evil one or the devil, we're talking about the same person. That is a great example of variation in gist. You might say to me, well, wait a minute, it's still a difference, that's true. What exactly did Jesus say? To which the answer is, well, it may not be the intent of the author to quote Jesus, but to summarize or to paraphrase as I said, you can still be accurate about who's being referred to in the midst of that, but you may not be able to answer the question, which term did Jesus actually use? What you can't remember term he used, he was definitely referring to the devil. He was definitely referring to Satan. He was definitely referring to the evil one. Any one of those works with that as the reference. So that's one example of the kind of variation in gist that I'm talking about. But there are other examples that are a little more challenging. The next one is the healing of the centurion's slave. This is a text that is both in Matthew and Luke. It's in Matthew 8 and in Luke 7. And there is a significant difference between the way these two are told. In Matthew, you have the impression of a face-to-face conversation between the centurion and Jesus. And there are no intermediaries. In Luke, you have two sets of Jewish intermediaries who come to Jesus on behalf of the centurion, and Jesus and the centurion never meet face-to-face. So there it is, a direct contradiction. What you don't notice is, and this is something Matthew does, I'm going to give a second example in just a second, is that Matthew often simplifies events that he portrays. He operates, if you will, in a more generalized way with the event, and then there's a thing called a cultural script that's at work in the way Matthew does this. The cultural script is what is called, a cultural script is an element of background in which the writer and the reader share the cultural background so I can speak in cultural shorthand and people will understand what's going on. So, what is the cultural script in this text? It is the principle of the shaliach, the sent one. Well, remember when Jesus said to his apostles, the one who hears you hears who? Hears me. In other words, if I send out the apostles in my name, they are speaking my message. If the centurion has emissaries to meet Jesus, because he's a Gentile, and of course the Jewish emissaries are Jewish, and meet Jesus and speaks on his behalf, it's as good as the centurion speaks. We actually do this, we just don't think about it. When the press secretary in the United States speaks, and there's that little sign over his or her head, depending on the press secretary in question and the president in question, that says White House. We don't care about what the press secretary is saying because the press secretary is key to this discussion. No, it's who the press secretary represents that makes what the press secretary says important, because we think that the press secretary is speaking on behalf of and represents the president. That's why the sign White House is over the press secretary's head when they're in the presidential briefing room in the White House. So we actually do this, we just don't think about it very much. And so this is an example of, again, a variation, but the variation here has to do with the way in which Matthew often abbreviates and simplifies stories and presents the existence of a cultural script which allows the centurion to be represented through the words of the Jewish emissaries that he sends to a plea to Jesus to heal the slave. Now I'm going to set up something that I call guy and gal telling, although I'm going to, on the other side, say this is not about gender, so just bear with me. But the next illustration I want to use is Jairus' daughter. This is one that often comes up, and some people say this is a clear example of a difference that matters. And the way this works is, in Mark and in Luke, Jairus' daughter is raised from the dead as part of the only double miracle in the New Testament, where there are two miracles intertwined with each other. Remember, Jairus appeals in Mark and in Luke to Jesus to come heal his daughter because she's very, very ill. And on the way, Jesus is interrupted by what I would call an attempt at a guerrilla healing. A guerrilla healing is a woman who says, I want to touch Jesus' garment. I want to get in and out as fast as I can, and I don't want him to notice. I just want to, if I touch the edge of his garment, he'll hear me. So she runs out, touches his garment, ends up being healed, and starts to dart away, except there's a problem. Jesus stops and says, who touched me? Okay, everything comes to a halt. Imagine you're Jairus on the way to the home and you're waiting for it's held up by this woman. And Jesus is going to engage this woman in a conversation, and time is of the essence. In fact, it's so of the essence that a messenger comes from the house while the conversation's going on and says, don't bother the teacher anymore because she's passed away. And all hope seems to be gone. Of course, he goes on and heals the girl. In Matthew, it's not told that way. In Matthew, when the story is introduced with Jairus' daughter being dead. Now, what's going on here? It's simple literary collapse. 14 verses in Mark have been reduced to 8 verses in Matthew. The only thing that Matthew cares about is not the details of the timing of the event, which Mark and Luke are giving us. The thing he cares about is by the time Jesus got to the girl, she was dead. And he summarizes it that way because that's the point of the healing. Okay? And again, Matthew has simplified the story, as he's often wont to do. And so it works like this. And so how do we explain these kinds of differences? I tell people it's guy and gal telling. Now let me talk about what guy and gal telling is. If I ask my wife if I have to be at dinner tonight, she will answer this question inevitably by walking through my schedule of the day that she's aware of and then explain why my presence is or is not required at dinner. If my wife asks me whether she needs to be at dinner tonight, she will get a short answer, a yes or a no. That's it. Okay? But this is not a gender thing. I have a colleague that I worked with for years who was married to a German. She's now passed away. But was married to a German. And if you had asked Ursula rather, if Hall needed to be at dinner, she would have answered, she's German as I said, ja or nein. Okay, she would have given you an answer. It would have been as short as my answer was. If you asked Hall, who I nicknamed Dr. Google, I taught classes with him, he thinks about things and knows things about things no one else even cares about. But you could Google him and he could give you the answer. Ursula had to be at dinner tonight. He would go through the history of Greco-Roman hospitality and take you through the history of hospitality until he answered the question. It's just people process and tell stories inherently differently. And they are driven by the way they generally tell stories and what they're concerned about and what they think is important in answering a question. And some people are detailed people, and some people are soundbite people. I know this. I host a podcast for the seminary. In the first few, and the way the first few questions are answered, I know whether I'm dealing with a soundbite person or what I call a footnote person. Okay? In a soundbite person, they answer the question directly, as short and as crisply as you could imagine. The footnote person gives you all the background and takes you through the Amazon jungle, clearing out all the brush along the way until we get to the river. And then they give you the answer. And so it's just the way different people are built. And that's the way telling. And some of this is the difference in choice in rendering the text as precisely as people are aware of, or summarizing or paraphrasing what's going on. These things produce variation, but those variations don't necessarily mean contradiction. So let me finish up by going through and saying this. This is a summary, but I have one piece left. The saying is that orality is a different kind of remembering, and that we lived in an oral world. In fact, we can ask the question, why is it that it took the church 30 or 50 or 60 years to write a gospel? Why didn't they do it immediately? There's a simple answer to that question, and it resides squarely in an oral world. In an oral world, the living voice is more important than the recorded voice. In other words, I want to hear directly from the eyewitnesses about what they experienced and remembered. Papias in the 2nd century talks about the value of the living voice and the way in which living voices are valued. So that means as long as you had living witnesses and they were available, we'll let them tell the stories of Jesus and worry about writing it down until we start to lose the living voices. By the way, the same thing has happened with Holocaust. In the Holocaust, you had people who were sharing their stories, etc. Then all of a sudden around the 1990s, all these people said, we're going to lose all these Holocaust witnesses. We ought to record them before they pass away so we have as full a record of the Holocaust as we can get, and people went about doing that. And even despite all that, there are people today who today, because we're so far away from the event, say, oh no, that really didn't happen. Despite all the voices. So, orality is a different kind of remembering, and it also produces a different kind of expectation about how testimony gets shared and the value of that testimony. Now, another thing that's true is, if you're used to doing it, in fact, I can say it stronger. It isn't that you're used to doing it. If it's the way most things happen, you're going to do it better all the time. You're going to be used to doing it. You're going to devise methods to help you do it, etc. Because we have all these crutches, either recorded on tape or by digital means, etc. We don't have to remember all these things, so we don't work so hard at keeping our memories in shape. They atrophy as a result. And so that's a second reality that we're dealing with. I've said to you, reality in the first century is not the telephone game. That's not the way to... And here's the next point that I want to make. The core is almost for sure right. Memory studies tell us this, and I'm going to tell you another story here that I was involved with that makes this point. Years ago, I was asked to lecture at the University of Michigan on the Gospel of Luke, and then do a PhD seminar afterwards on historical Jesus. The historical Jesus part of this was introduced by a Jewish professor who opened up. He knew I was from Dallas, so he knew I was theologically conservative. And he opened up by saying, we don't have a single thing that comes from Jesus. Everything that we have comes from people who either followed him or some distance from him. We don't have any direct voice of Jesus to introduce the problem. And so there happened to be 12 students in the room. You know, it's just what my kids called when they were young, a coinky-dink. Okay, this thing going on in the room, there were 12 people in the room. And I turned to this professor and said, let's assume that you've never written anything about what you believe. So we don't have your voice. But these students have been with you 3+ years as doctoral students, and they've been in your class year after year, hearing what you teach. Are you telling me that they couldn't tell me what your emphases were in what you taught? The room went silent. So here's the point that I'm making. The debate we have about the details. The one thing that is almost for sure the case is that the disciples understood to their core, because Jesus said it again and again and again and again in various ways, how Jesus presented himself and where he was in the midst of this big story. So the core is surely right. We may have variation, but we also have gist. In the gap, and now I want to illustrate for you, and this is the final thing that I'm going to do, that it's not as great a gap time-wise when it comes to the core teaching of the church. And here's why. So we've said, let me get the microphone. So we've said, I'll turn it back on. Is it on? There we go. No, yep. So we've said there's a 30 to 50 to 60 year gap, but it's actually better than this when it comes to the core teaching of the church. And now I'm thinking about Paul wrote Galatians that has this core theology in it about Jesus in 49. Okay? Our gap just went from 30, 50, or 60 years. Now we're down to about 15 to 18 years. Most people date Galatians around 49, so 33, that's 16 years. 30 would be 19 years. So 16 to 19 year gap. But it's actually better than that. Because Paul's conversion, which requires the same core theology, took place somewhere around 18 months to 3 years after the events in Jerusalem. And it's even better than that. Because when this experience takes place, that theology has to be in place for him to process what Jesus appearing to him actually means. He's been spending his time persecuting the apostles in their preaching and saying that's not true because, one, he was in Jerusalem at the time. He was one of the chief prosecutors of the Jewish leadership about representing the Jewish position against the apostolic position on Jesus. And literally now we're on top of the events themselves in the same location. So our gap has gone from 30, 50, or 60 years literally down to a handful of months in the same location with the same background. And that's why Paul is so important to this. Because remember, Paul had heard the apostles teach, and he certainly heard Stephen preach, which is earlier than the event of his own conversion. He knew what the official Jewish position was. He knew what the Christian position was. And when Jesus appeared to him, he went, uh-oh, the apostles had this right. And there we are. So the importance of Paul is he knew the debate, he knew the events, he knew the tradition, and he was in Jerusalem at the time. So this is what I've said. I took a long time to say it, but basically what I'm saying is this oral tradition floating through eyewitnesses and involving memory because it's corporate and repeated and because it's set up with an oversight that the apostles are involved in is not the telephone game. It's able to be remembered and able to be remembered well. One final point. Sometimes it's said, and I've said this to you, in fact, I gave you a quote that says this, we don't know who the authors of the Gospels actually are. So, the argument is, we don't know who the author is, and so in the skeptical take or askeptical take of this, what's said is, so the church picked figures who were prominent in the early church to raise the stature of a gospel that needed to have a raised stature because we didn't know who the author was. Okay? So you can do anything you want. You can pick anyone that you want. Let me tell you why that doesn't work and why the tradition seems to know what it's doing. And it goes like this. Let's talk about this. In the gospel according to Mark, there is a tradition from the early 2nd century. Eusebius tells us about this, and he quotes Papias, who wrote a work that we've now lost called The Exposition of Our Lord, 5 volumes. In it, he talks about the fact that Mark got some of his content from Peter. Now, if Mark is not the author of the second gospel, remember that's the claim, that the person attached to the gospel is not the person who wrote it, but someone trying to elevate the status of the gospel. If he's not the author of the second gospel, what do we know about Mark? We know 2 things. Okay? He didn't make it through the first missionary journey. He went home to mama. Okay? In the midst of the pressure of the first missionary journey. What's the second thing that we know about Mark? He caused a split between Barnabas and Paul before the second missionary journey. And so Paul went and did his thing, and Barnabas went and did his thing with Mark. Those are the 2 things we know about Mark. Now ask yourself this question. If that's your resume, if that's your CV, is that going to raise the stature of a gospel that you don't know the name of the author to? And it's even worse than that. Because that tradition is sitting out there from Papias saying Peter contributed to this gospel. Anything you wanted. Between Peter and Mark as the author of the second gospel, and you could put either name on that gospel to give it its imprimatur. And you had the choice between Peter and Mark, who would you pick? It's not even close. You'd pick Peter in the drop of a hat. But the tradition didn't do that. The tradition said, no, this gospel belongs to Mark. It's not Peter's. So that undercuts the theory about the authorship. The tradition is pretty careful because my own belief is that the original churches that started to circulate these gospels knew who the gospels went back to, and you didn't start to specify which gospel it was until you had multiple gospels circulating. In fact, most people think that the superscriptions we have on the manuscripts that identify the gospel according to is the Greek word kata, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, that those superscriptions date from the early 2nd century when multiple gospels are circulating between the churches, and we want to know which gospel are we talking about when it was shared orally in the service. So, with all that, this is what I'm saying. Orality is important. There are actually good historical, cultural, sociological answers to the question of what do we do with the gap between the event and the writing of the gospel. And to deal with that, you've got to understand the nature of orality. You've got to understand how eyewitnesses worked. You've got to understand the repetition of the story. You've got to understand the corporate nature of the communication. And you've got to understand the variation in gist with which the Gospels work so that difference doesn't equal contradiction. And lo and behold, you get a story of Jesus that you can talk about and as going back to reflecting what the apostles experienced when they were with Jesus. And with that, I'm done.
Well, thank you very much, Darrell, for that incredibly enlightening lecture and a case well made. So many good points there, and perhaps there are folks here or people online that want to ask questions of clarity or maybe want to challenge you a little bit on something. So we will have a question and answer period at this time. For those who are present here, there's a microphone on each side of the audience. I ask that you go to that microphone to ask your question so that it can be heard by everyone, and so that it's also captured on the recording. So please just don't yell out your question. For those who are online, again, it's an email to questions@regent-college.edu. And when you ask your question, and after Darrell has given a response, if there is for you an immediate follow-up, we'll certainly allow that. We just want to be respectful of our time and of others that may have a question. So I don't see anyone going to the microphone right now, so I'll start with the first question. Perhaps someone's about, well, if you're about to move there, please. I always want our guests to have the first question. So thank you.
About oral tradition. What if somebody proposed this to you about an example of oral tradition? Donald Trump operates largely orally. And his modus operandi says, if you want people to believe a lie, first of all, make it a big lie, and just keep repeating it, and people will eventually believe it. What would you respond to somebody that says that's the way oral tradition works, at least in some cases?
Okay, so let's pick out the big event in the New Testament as an illustration of this claim. Because a lot of people say that the early church... Okay, so there are certain things we need to know in order to think through this. The first is that resurrection was not a popular idea in the Greco-Roman world. The Greeks didn't believe in it. They thought when you died, you were either dead, or they did believe in a thing called the immortality of the soul, but they did not believe in the concept of a bodily resurrection, which only some Jews also believed. The Pharisees believed it, but the Sadducees didn't. So you've got an unpopular idea, okay? And then you've got the problem of a crucified Messiah, which no one was expecting. And you're claiming that this was made up to kind of revive the crucified Messiah idea. And so the way I like to talk about this, as you can tell, I like to have a little fun. Imagine you're in the PR meeting between the crucifixion and the claimed resurrection. And your meeting and the agenda on the docket is, we want to keep hope alive. How do we being argued is, the apostles made up the resurrection and the doctrine of the resurrection in order to keep hope alive. So someone raises their hand in the meeting and goes, oh, I have a great idea. Why don't we promote the bodily resurrection in front of the culture? An idea that is not popular in the culture. And then my second idea is, let's make the first witnesses for this event women. dun, 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 dun. It's not worth it unless you go through the whole thing. So, women did not count in the culture as witnesses. They didn't. They were only restricted to testimony in a family member, cases of sexual assault. But basically, they didn't count as witnesses. You have witness after witness in the first century, Josephus being among them, the famous Jewish historian, who said women don't count as this. So someone comes along and says, the lie that we're going to make up is that Jesus was physically resurrected, an unpopular idea. And the people who are going to start off as our main witnesses will be women who don't culturally count as witnesses. The question becomes, would anyone make up the story that way and make it be culturally sensitive? And the answer to that question is very unlikely. You want to follow up?
Trump accused Hillary Clinton of running, a pedophile child exploitation ring and a lot of other crazy stuff out of the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. I think on the surface it would just seem totally crazy, and who would believe it? And a lot of people did.
There's one other major difference, and that is that the people that you're talking about who are being accused of making up the story actually care morally about what they do and say. I'm not going to put that description on the example that you've raised.
Thank you. I'm just throwing the agree with your presentation.
Yeah.
And I think I'd like to say to our dear American brother, well done on keeping the focus on the gospel narrative and not veering into a discussion of U.S. politics. So, well done. And we have our second question, please.
Yeah, I'm just interested in what your take is on the synoptic problem.
Synoptic problem, I do think Mark is the first gospel written. I also think there is something like a Q source that has now been lost. And let me explain how Q exists. There's about 225 verses in Matthew and Luke, mostly teaching material, that overlap. And the premise for Q is this is about almost a fifth of each of those gospels. And if Matthew didn't use Luke and Luke didn't use Matthew, there has to be some place where these came from. So, and the idea of there being such a source in an oral culture, and then what happened to the source, it's either primarily oral and or a mixture of oral and written. And once this material got incorporated into gospels that were circulating from the church, you didn't need the source anymore.
And Darrell, for those who may not know, when you reference Q source,
yes.
Do you want to just explain what
Q
that means?
source is, the Q traditionally has been said to stand for the German word Quelle, which means source. And it is some type of traditional material about Jesus, predominantly Jesus' teaching. In fact, if you analyze it even more carefully, there are actually 6 themes of Jesus' teaching that it covers. And so the idea is this teaching was circulated in the churches, and this was the tradition through which it circulated.
Correct, and it has nothing to do with QAnon. So we have another question.
You're trying to
Pierre?
keep that theme in front of us. Go ahead.
A question here and then over here. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It was brilliant. I've just heard you in the past talk about things that the church believed before the Gospels were written. I think you talked about creeds and sacraments and hymns and things like that.
You're talking about, this is a book that I did on the missing Gospels and why the missing Gospels are not a part of the canon. And that argument, that's actually its own total separate lecture. But the gist of that argument is there are two, I have to figure out how much, okay, so am I going to be a footnote person or a soundbite person? I'm going to give you an in-between version. The argument is that in the beginning, there wasn't orthodoxy and then it branched out into all these alternatives. The university campuses today is, in the beginning, there were a variety of Christianities. Those variety of Christianities are seen in these additional gospels that we've found. History is written by the winners, and because history is written by the winners, they preserved the memory of their stuff, and they wiped out the memory of the long-term existence of this other material until we rediscovered it places like Nag Hammadi in the 1940s in Egypt. What I argued was, and that Irenaeus, Irenaeus in the latter part of the 2nd century, about 175, is the one who is the real father of orthodoxy. He's the one who talked about 4 gospels, etc. So that's the model that we're dealing with. So I wrote a book called The Missing Gospels, in which I went through this theory. And what I tried to show is, in the writings that predate Irenaeus on the Orthodox side, the core teaching of Christianity is consistent and the same. Variations, they're all over the place, and they could never have emerged out of the Judaism that the disciples came out of and embraced. Not just because of what the other views had to say about Jesus, because Jesus isn't a savior in those Gospels. He is a pointer to spiritual enlightenment, basically, which is a category the Orthodox Gospels won't let you have for Jesus. Anyway, but in the doctrine of the Father as creator. Because the creation story in these other Gospels is primarily the idea that it wasn't God who created, or the first, archon that created. It was underling gods, and they botched the job, including a female deity, because sometimes it's argued that these other Gospels have a place for a female deity. Watch what you ask for. Okay? Because a female deity is part of how the creation got botched, and a descendant of that female creation is actually the one who's responsible for the first human beings. And it was flawed from the beginning. That's in contrast to Genesis 1 and 2, which says the creation in the beginning was good and very good. So my argument is there's no way that a movement that came out of Judaism in the way that we're talking about, with the conception of God that existed, could have this kind of doctrine of the creation. It is so. And then I went through and I showed how consistently through the creeds, through the hymns, etc., this core theology was taught and present before 175, in light of the contrast, which is in the missing Gospels, the teaching about God is going all over the place. So you just got a little mini lecture.
All right, thank you.
Okay?
If there's no follow-up, we'll go over here to this side of the room. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Bock, for your lecture. I'm wondering if you might just talk a little bit about some of the pushback that Kenneth Bailey's work has received from orality and social memory theorists, that it is a very specific, structured, modern-day example that he's working with that being applied. There's a lot of problems that have been.
Yeah, people say it's anachronistic, that it's a later example of an earlier phenomenon.
Yeah, and just kind of with that, so what would you say around that criticism? And are there other examples that you might point to correct?
Well, there are a couple of things. One is his argument fundamentally is that this is an extremely conservative culture that lives in this cultural environment, has been in this cultural environment. Nothing has changed about the cultural environment that these people have operated in and how they pass on their stories. That's his justification for thinking it might be an example that might be much, much earlier. There's a lot of discussion about how orality is to talk about the way in which this approach fits what we see in the Gospels, which is this variation in gist principle that I was talking about, and the way the phenomena works. The rabbinic model, as I said, says too much. That's not what we have in the Gospels. We don't have that kind of a result. But the this can go anywhere model also has severe problems in terms of the way the stories get repeated and what we can see in the text. So I'll say it this way. Of the 3 models that get presented, this one looks like it's closest to what we have than any of the other proposals.
Please.
Thank you for your lecture. I have 2 questions about John. One, I'd love to hear your take on John's relationship to the synoptics. And 2, you represented the traditional or majority take on John's later dating. And I'd love to know what you make of the minority or contrarian take on either the priority of John or at least the earlier composition of John.
Yeah, obviously I'm skeptical on the earlier date, but it really doesn't change this lecture very much. Because if John has the earlier date that some people propose, it will be, it will be in the 60s. So it just goes into the synoptic bucket. How to think about John. This is a whole nother, I have a whole lecture that's dedicated to this. Think of John and the synoptics this way. There's going to be a lesson coming out of this. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the term synoptic is from two Greek words, the word soon and optic. Optic is see and soon is together. So you see these gospels together because they overlap with a lot of the same events. That's why they're called the synoptic gospels. John is about 10% of what's in John is not in the other gospels. It's the first observation to make. Second observation to make, once I say it, you'll go, yep, that's the way it works. Everything that goes on Christologically in the synoptic gospels is subtle. Everything that goes on in John's gospel is a 2x4 hitting you in the middle of the head. It's very direct. That's why the church loves the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John does all our heavy lifting for us. So when push comes to shove and we're sharing about Jesus, the church runs to the Gospel of John versus the synoptics. Because John tells you from the very beginning where he's coming from. And this is how I articulate the difference. In the synoptic gospels, you are telling the story of Jesus from the earth up. You start with categories that you're sort of used to, and you watch it dawn on people who Jesus is by how the story unfolds in all three of those gospels. Now, there's a little hint that something is going on in Matthew and Luke because you have a thing called the virgin birth. Okay, but for the most part, you're telling the story from the earth up. In John, you're telling the story from heaven down. It starts in the very first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is CNN. Okay? That's how John opens. And so you know from the very first verse where John is taking you. And I think John is, I call it the gospel, not as it's from heaven down, it's also the gospel on further review. Because there are places where he says, Jesus lies or get until after he was glorified. And so that's the difference. Now, why does that difference matter? It matters for this reason. Everyone who comes to Jesus, without exception, comes to Jesus through the path of the synoptic gospels and not through the path of John. This is what I mean. When no one comes to Jesus this way, they were born, they get the swat of life, and they go, wah, 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 the Jesus, the second person of the ontological Trinity, wah, wah. No one comes to Jesus like that. Everyone, at some point in their life, has to have someone explain the uniqueness of who Jesus is. How unique is Jesus? Well, let me ask it this way. And it is, how many human beings that have ever walked the earth could credibly claim to be the Creator God? All the human beings who ever existed. I actually asked Google, how many human beings have existed on the history of the earth in its lifetime? They gave me a number, 117 billion. Don't ask me how they know that. Okay, so give or take, the 117 billion human beings who've walked in the history of humanity on this earth, how many of them fit that category? Only one. You talk about a unique category, you talk about a unicorn category, that's what Jesus is in. And that means that everyone has to have that category created for them in one way or another. The way the synoptic gospels do it is they build the case for who Jesus is gradually, and you watch it dawn on people how that category gets created. And it's done through storytelling and scripts that show that Jesus is doing stuff God does. It's the primary way it gets done. It's not done by what Jesus says about himself, it's by what Jesus does. In John goes the other route. He says, I'm going to tell you the conclusion at the start, and I'm going to continue to repeat it as I tell the story. The church loves John, but everyone who comes to Jesus through the category of the synoptic gospels. Here's my plea. The church needs to learn how to retell the story the way the synoptics tell it, because that's the way people who hear it have to hear it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Darrell. We are pretty much at the end of our time, but just checking that Pablo neither has an online question or that you didn't have a follow-up question, sir? No? Okay, just checking because you're still standing there in the back. So, well, Darrell, thank you for a wonderful lecture. We admire your great your presentation, the engaging way in which you offered this lecture, and for giving us a greater confidence in the gospel narrative and minding the gap, which you have shown us to be much smaller than we maybe imagined, and nothing that we really actually need to worry about. So thank you for the skillful way you've presented. Thank you to this audience. It's always a great encouragement when we have these lectures. We're so glad that we have the online option. We live stream, so this lecture reaches far more people than when they were just here. But it is always great to have an audience present. That's an encouragement to the speaker and to those of you that have made the effort to be here tonight. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you for the skillful way in which you answered those questions, Darrell. And I want to say a thank you to all of our many supporters who make it possible for us to offer these free evening public lectures throughout the summer. One of those rare people that carry cash on you, and you want to make a little gift at the back just to show your appreciation and ensure that we keep doing these. You can do that, or you can go online to rgnt.net/give and make a donation that way. Would you, having been thanked yourself for your participation, your great questions, would you join with me, though, in thanking Darrell for a marvelous lecture tonight? Thank you. Darrell, I'm going to make a couple of closing announcements. You're free to make your way to the bookstore so you can get set up there and not get interrupted as you're trying to make your way out. Just a couple of quick announcements. This lecture will be available shortly, as in, within a day or so, on our YouTube channel. I won't give you that full address, you won't remember it, but you can just Google YouTube, Regent College, and it'll take you right to our channel, where all of our summer lectures eventually are posted, and they'll be available through the summer till the end of August. This lecture, want to go back and play it again because you maybe missed something, or to hear what Darrell said for greater clarification, or even better, share it with friends and pass it on to say, hey, watch this lecture. Just go to our YouTube channel. If you are here in the Lower Mainland and wish to join us this week, we have two other events happening this week. On Wednesday at 12 noon, here, and for our online audience, it's only available in person. It's not being live streamed or recorded. Will be a noontime conversation with Dr. Quentin Jenis, who is teaching here this week. He is a medical doctor, and he will be hosting us for a healthcare Q&A, and that's Wednesday at 12 noon. And then Wednesday evening, 7:30, right here, for those who wish to be present physically, and it will again be online, is our next evening lecture, The Theological Imagination, Judith Wolf, who is present with us teaching this week. So that's what's coming up the remainder of this week. Tomorrow is Tuesday. That's when we have chapel during spring and summer. If you wish to join us, 11:45 right here in our chapel, a lovely 45-minute service of worship. One of our visiting professors will be bringing us the word. You are most welcome to join us for that, whether you're studying here this week or a guest. Please do join us. So Tuesday for chapel, Wednesday for lunchtime conversation, Wednesday evening a lecture. Don't know if I've missed anything, but as you heard from Pablo at the very beginning, subscribe to Regent News and Updates, and you'll know everything that's happening at this school through this summer and throughout the year. Thank you for being here. God bless you. Have a safe trip home. Good night.